Okay, then there we are. So hi everybody. Happy Friday to everybody. This is the webinar on a material transition, mining and transitions. We are going to wait for a while, 3 to 5 minutes. This is going to be a bilingual seminar, so I'm going to change now to Spanish in order to give the same instructions and to welcome everybody. So see you in 3 to 5 minutes. Hola a todo el mundo, a todos y a todas, ¿cómo están? Vamos a empezar ahorita la sesión de Material Transition, minería y transiciones. Vamos a esperar 3 a 5 minutos para que se conecten todas las personas y ya empezamos con nuestros invitados. Muchas gracias por estar. Para las personas que están llegando, vamos a esperar un par de minutos para que se vayan conectando todos y ya empezamos. So for the people who are logging in, we are going to wait a couple of minutes more so that the others can join and then we'll start. Okay, so we can be starting right now. I think people will be joining later. So I'll start in English. Voy a estar hablando inglés. This is a bilingual webinar, so we are going to be using English and Spanish. Of course, as many of you know, if you click on the word icon in the bar of Zoom, you can choose the channel that you wish. We have simultaneous translation in English or Spanish. So please check in there and you will get a menu and you choose the channel, your language, your preferred language, and you can listen in that language. Y lo mismo para el español. Entonces, si necesitan interpretación de lo que están diciendo nuestros panelistas, simplemente van al icono del mundito con los paralelos y meridianos y escogen el idioma nativo en el que quieran escuchar el seminario. Yo voy a estar hablando en inglés, entonces más que todo es por eso, y nuestros presentadores también. Okay, so first of all, as always, I would like to introduce for the ones that do not know who AIDA is. AIDA is a non-profit international organization that uses law and science to protect the environment, primarily in Latin America. We are located in all of those cities. We have offices in San Francisco, Mexico City, and Bogota, but our collaborators, attorneys, scientists, communications team, and administrative team are all over the continent. We have made this webinar series, The True Cost of Mining, since 2018, with topics such as community monitoring, the prediction of mining impacts, some study cases. In 2019, we have continued this trend of community monitoring. We also included topics like fracking, mining on glaciers, deep sea mining, which is a key topic today as well, perpetual impacts, and metallic mining in Central America. In 2020, we, of course, included the topic of the pandemic because it was really important to talk about it. We talked about just transition. We talked about geophysics, more like beyond extractivism. And of course, a topic that was asked about, it was extractivism and radioactivity, which deals with uranium mining passives in Latin America. And finally, in 2021, we have made 2 webinars, one about hydrogeology of high salt flats in the Andes, and mining in the Andes, but more focused on copper and lithium, about the energy transition. Today, we are doing a webinar on a report that was made by Andy Whitmore and the people at War on Want, which is called A Material Transition. It's a report that researches the impacts of the increased demand of minerals, this market that is coming around for the transition, for the energy transition. And we would like to problematize some of those things that are happening right now, because not every transition is a just transition, and not every like the energy transition is necessarily a transition if it doesn't have to do with materials transition as well. So our panelists for the day are Andy Whitmore. Andy is currently freelance contractor working in finance advocacy for the deep sea mining campaign. He has an MA in development studies from the School of Oriental and African Studies from the University of London. He has worked on issues like mining and affected communities since the 1980s. He is part of the Mine Watch collective, actually, and he has helped to found the London Mining Network, which where he coordinated an EU project and is currently the co-chair of the organization. And we also have Sebastian Ordonez Muñoz. He is a Colombian migrant based in the UK. He is the senior program officer for Latin America for War on Want, which is the organization that published this wonderful report. And he works very closely with frontline communities, with networks and collectives resisting extractivism. So with no further ado, we're going to start with Andy so that he can give us the first ideas about the document, and then we're going to pass to Sebastian. So thank you very much. Andy, the floor is yours, and I'll stop sharing my screen so that you can do the same.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Andrés, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. I'm going to share my screen, so I'm hoping now that you can see my screen. Okay, so is the screen visible? You give me a thumbs up.
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay.
See? There we go.
Oh, great. It's arrived. Okay, thank you. So again, my gratitude for being able to talk today. I'm definitely looking forward to explaining some of what's in this report. It's a long report, It covers many issues, and I only have a short period of time. I'm sorry if I'm going to just summarize some of the issues, but I think it's important to click on the main topics, and then hopefully during the conversation we can discuss more of the points. And I will really try to speak slowly. So I apologize, I'm only speaking in English, but thank you for the interpreters. So the report, as mentioned, it's mainly published by War on Want, but supported by London Mining Network and the Yes to Life and No to Mining group. It's called A Material Transition, and as the name suggests, it's about supply and demand solutions around renewable energy minerals. Having mentioned London Mining Network, I'm co-chair there, and most of my work on this is around London Mining Network. I better explain what it is. It's a UK-based organisation, and its aim is a just future based on a lower demand for mining and on respect for human rights and ecological justice where mining does take place. It's a network, so we actually have 22 groups now. It says 21, but UK-based Latin American Bureau has just joined us. So we're made up of different member groups, including War on Want. And the reason that we are based in London is that it is one of the biggest centres of mining in the world. 4 of the 5 major mining companies have some base there. It's also the home to the London Metal Exchange and also home to the main industry lobbying body, the International Council on Mining and Metals. So what's the problem? I think this slide does a good job of explaining what the problem is. So in the top right-hand side, you have a slide which shows the amount of CO2 increasing. So we clearly have a climate crisis. Just below it, over a 100-year period, as well as the top slide, you have the amount of energy that's increasing, our energy use. And clearly the two of these are linked. So clearly we need to sort out energy consumption, but particularly fossil fuel energy that's contributing to CO2 emissions. What's interesting for me is the slide on the left. Now, it's not on the same time scale. It starts in 1960 rather than the last 100 years. But you can see that it's very similar in terms of how the graph looked. And since 1960, the amount of steel, copper, and zinc had increased massively. In fact, it's trebled over 50 years. I think it's worth pointing out that copper and steel particularly have huge environmental footprint and contribute to climate change themselves, not least because of the amount of coal that's used in steel making, and also contribute to biodiversity and environmental crises, land thefts, human rights abuses. So looking at that as a picture of the whole, it's worth remembering that our resource use has tripled since 1970, and it's likely to keep continuing to increase unless we do something. Yet we live in a finite planet with limited planetary boundaries. So I think that's something that we need to address. I think the point is that we've got this increasing reduction of resources, and that's a fundamental problem in itself that needs addressing. I mean, the short form that's used for this very often is extractivism, which is the wholesale extraction of common ecological goods. I would argue that we can't work properly or consider any of the issues around the energy crisis unless we also consider materials as a whole. I would argue that what we have is not an energy crisis, what we have is a materials crisis. As it's been sold at the moment, the main story is that we have a climate crisis, and the way that we'll deal with this, the transition away from fossil fuels, is going to be by solar panels, by wind. Yet all of those require yet more materials to be dug up, yet more minerals to be dug up. So basically, there are for actors who are arguing for getting our way out of a climate crisis. And those are particularly the large mining companies who now kind of see themselves as the heroes of the energy transition. At least one miner has dubbed what's coming as the revenge of the miners, the idea that they're going to be able to make as much money as possible. It's also referred to as a black to green transformation. There's this idea that companies are no longer digging coal, but digging green metals. I mean, we would say a lot of that is effectively greenwashing. Effectively, they're trying to make themselves look better by producing green credentials. And many of those companies are still involved in fossil fuel production. And perhaps more importantly, many of the same minerals that we'll talk about, these transition minerals, are also used in a whole range of different products, including for the militarism, including for armies. So what we're looking at is this new potential mining frontier. And if the whole area of extractivism is about producing more resources, then this is clearly labelled as green extractivism. There's this idea that human rights and ecosystems are going to be sacrificed to mining in the name of solving climate change. So what metals are we talking about? We use the term transition minerals to talk about these different minerals that are going to be used in your energy transition. And this slide shows what they are. So you've got three categories. And in the first category, you've got items used for renewable energy itself. So for solar panels, for wind turbines, for geothermal plants. And it's estimated that a single 3 megawatt wind turbine needs 335 tons of steel, almost 5 tons of copper, 3 tons of aluminium, and up to 2 tons of rare earth elements. So if you amplify the number of wind turbines you need, the amount of ore that needs to be dug up, the amount of metal that needs to be dug up with all the waste rock, then you're talking about a really significant amount of digging and processing. The second is the batteries used for energy storage. And in the past, obviously, we were mainly digging up lead and zinc for lead zinc batteries, but obviously increasingly now you're talking about lithium ion batteries. So you're talking about cobalt, lithium, and nickel. Now, I think these are the main minerals that tend to be focused on when you first think of transition minerals. And that's mainly because there is going to be a huge increase. Actually, the starting amounts of those materials that are dug up, I think are less than some of the ones I mentioned earlier, like copper, and nickel even. So obviously important, again, just to kind of bear in mind, the general volume that we're talking about. And also important to bear in mind that in terms of batteries, that there's going to be a lot of substitution, a lot of innovation very quickly in terms of the materials that are used. So particularly cobalt, they're now talking about no longer using that and substituting it. However, they're likely to substitute it with nickel, and nickel has its own problems. So unless you're talking about the potential for switching lithium to sodium, where you could potentially use seawater, each of those changes, except in a situation like that, can be problematic. And the third area, which is often forgotten about, is the transmission infrastructure. So it's about moving the electricity that's going to be required on the power grids. And that's especially going to need a large amount of copper wire. So together, that's obviously a huge amount. And the World Bank at the moment is talking about potential for graphite, lithium, and cobalt being increased by 500% by 2050, and maybe 3 billion tons of minerals to be needed for the switch to renewables. So where are the likely impacts going to be? So we've got this idea of new green extractivism. I think it's going to be very much like the old extractivism, very much a supercharged version, a stronger version of it. So meaning that the communities and the ecosystems that are going to be sacrificed are likely to be in the global south, or maybe indigenous territory within the global north, so in the United States, Canada, Australia. And we produced this map for the report, and it just shows some cases. Unfortunately, we just couldn't show all of the cases, but we wanted to, to give an indication of where some of the minerals were likely to come from. Within the report, we focused on two main case studies, and we chose to concentrate on nickel mining in the Philippines and Indonesia. And we did that because a lot of the reports before had tended to focus more on lithium mining, particularly in the lithium triangle in Argentina, Chile and Bolivia, or on cobalt in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So particularly bearing in mind that shift from cobalt, we thought, it would be useful to concentrate on nickel. But, all the way through the report, we use examples from the deserts of Argentina, Chile, Bolivia, I mentioned, through to the forests in West Papua in Indonesia, where there are impacted communities with the rise of this green extractivism. And I think it's also worth noting that some of these new frontiers are also in what you'd call the old world. So they're going to be in Europe, they're going to be in the United States of America. So at the moment, you're talking about lithium mining in Spain, in Portugal, in Serbia, rare earth mining in Sweden, and lithium mining in Nevada in the United States as well. It's interesting that both scale of the minerals required and also the fact that some of these countries now want to control the supply chain means that they'll be mining in countries that have normally relied on other countries to do their mining for them. So, having mentioned that there's so many communities are going to be impacted, I think it's important to point out that one of the main issues is that there are communities who are resisting, who are struggling against this. And what's interesting that comes out in the report is the idea that many of these communities themselves are trying to protect ways of life that can show people in the West ways we should be living. They embody this idea of the need to transform our energy-intense societies to ones that are democratic and talk about the fair access of essential elements for a dignified life. So concepts like buen vivir, which many people in Latin America will be familiar with, and we don't have a good English translation for, I guess it's sort of living with well-being is the best translation. So a lot of our focus has been on supporting local movements who are resisting extraction, working in solidarity with them to protect their lives and livelihoods. And I think for us, a lot of that is about supporting indigenous communities in their right to free, prior, informed consent, and other communities who are trying to exert their right to say no to mining. So in terms of the different solution areas, if you will, what we can do about it, as we mentioned, we divided the report into looking at supply side and demand side. So on the supply side, one of the key issues that we wanted to look at was different standards that were being used. So there's a key number of different standards, but there's a number of different laws, a number of different schemes, and we created a whole set of tables that looked at these different things, looked at international laws, looked at national laws and schemes, looked at voluntary schemes. It's just the number of them are just incredible. It's just so difficult, and more are being produced at the moment. Some of them focusing on geographical areas, some of them focusing on specific minerals, so maybe cobalt, maybe gold, and they're all interlocking. I think the sheer number of these different laws and schemes really means that consolidation and coordination is required. So suppliers and manufacturers are going to have to work with civil society, especially impacted communities, to ensure that these schemes are going to be effective and that they'll be legitimate. But even more importantly, there needs to be a kind of a level of mandatory compliance in many of the schemes. Many of these are just purely voluntary. So they first have to be effective in terms of how they work, but then effective in terms of having credibility by having, for instance, laws where you can take a company to court rather than it just voluntarily trying to match a particular scheme. And I think one of the key points is in dealing with that is to that lack of effective binding mechanism, particularly to ensure respect for human rights, is by holding transnational corporations to account, and that's likely to be through an international binding treaty on business and human rights. The other area we wanted to look at particularly was on demand side, was about consumption, which was quite unusual for those of us working on mining, because we've tended to work with communities, we've tended to work on supply chains. Questioning our own demand, our own consumption was sort of novel. And the report comes up with a number of practical solutions that could be initiated or accelerated to inform choices about energy and resource consumption. I think we wanted to stress particularly that when it is to an extent about individual choice, it's not really down to the individual. We're not going to solve this by making better choices in terms of which electric car we choose, for instance. There are really serious, ambitious schemes that need to be put in place, ambitious policies. And effectively, they need to lead to this idea of a circular economy. That's the idea where you reduce the need for new resource extraction, to ensuring that as much as possible you have reuse, you have repurposing, and then where you can't anymore, you then recycle as the last option. However, it's not just enough to switch to this idea of a circular society, but with green growth. So it's no good just to swap an electric vehicle for a petrol-driven vehicle, for a diesel-driven vehicle, but just produce more and more of them. Because of that scale of increased consumption that's going on, that scale of increased mining, we need an effective solution which is much more radical in terms of unsustainable consumption, particularly in terms of the global north, but I think across the world as well to an extent. And that's where we've come up with this idea. Well, it's an idea that we found while doing the research, but the idea of a circular society rather than just a circular economy. And the idea behind this is that you can have a circular economy, this idea that you're constantly returning the resources back, but under green growth, it can still be continually growing. But even if you have a closed loop, you're still going to be drawing in more and more resources. And clearly, we just don't have that many resources to use aside from the impact of what's going on. So the diagram on the left talks about classic circular economy, where it's materials and energy resources which are just being circulated. Whereas the idea of a circular society is it's one where you include the likes of wealth, power, technology, and knowledge. So it's much more about communal ownership, it's much more about sharing, it's much more about equality. And I think a really good practical example of this is in terms of recycling lithium batteries. So at the moment, there's a big need for a big push to recycle the lithium batteries, but particularly for cobalt, because cobalt is expensive to mine. And so it's from an economic point of view, it makes sense to recycle the cobalt. Lithium is relatively cheaper to mine. And so at the moment, they're not really looking at mining lithium. So from a circular economy point of view, you may end up it not been economic to do it. So you would still be bringing in more lithium. Whereas from a circular society point of view, it's down not just to whether it's economic to recycle, it's whether it's good for society as a whole. So in conclusion, the main points of the report, main recommendations, key one was we need a global effort to bring together those most affected by the problems at the heart of transition minerals. There's this idea that we need to be all working together, focused particularly on 3 areas. The first is international solidarity for those most impacted by transition minerals. So need to make sure that we don't have people who are effectively sacrificed. The second is to advance initiatives to ensure fair and just global supply chains for renewable energy technology. And the third is for a fundamental societal change to reduce unsustainable material consumption. Okay, so that's my presentation. I'll just finish on a final slide showing both a graphic that was in a first report that we produced on the right-hand side that shows the ways to move go beyond extractivism, and also just to leave you with a thought that although some of the areas we're talking about seem ambitious, particularly in terms of that idea of reducing consumption, members of the European Parliament have recently voted for legally binding targets to reduce resource use within the European Union by 2030 and to bring their consumption within planetary boundaries by 2050. So there are moves that have been done, particularly in Europe. Clearly, it's something that needs to be addressed globally. Okay, thanks very much. I'll stop sharing the screen now.
Thank you very much, Andy. That was amazing. I mean, the main takeouts, what you talked about, the great acceleration, you know, from the 60s, these exponential curves that are taking us outside the biophysical limits of our planet. The use of extracted resources, that's a point that I would like to touch upon later, because the military use and the continued use of individual cars and things like that, not convivial economies or new ways to, you know, relate ourselves with the planet, is going to have a huge cost. No matter what transition we invent or we give RP to, is going to mean a huge cost. I also really liked the fact that you mentioned that the impacts are going to stay in the global south, either in the global south or in ancestral territories of indigenous communities. So the disproportionate allocation of costs is going to continue. It's very interesting to learn about that. And you also touched upon the control of the supply chain. And I would add, not only like they are outsourcing the mining in other countries, and we are seeing countries that are effectively, you know, acting like empires of extraction, but they also outsource the exertion of violence upon the communities in which they are mining, which is a phenomenon that it's very concerning. And of course, the main message: green growth is not enough. Green growth is another road that will keep the path dependence that we are in. We need a circular economy within a circular society. So that's amazing takeouts. Thank you very much, Andy. And with that, I would like to pass to Sebastian. So he has a very, very nice reflections on the report and on the general topic of just transitions. So Seb, go ahead.
Thanks so much, Andrés, and thank you, Whit. I don't have a presentation as such, so I do hope you'll bear with me as I give some reflections that that we've been collectively developing since the report launched back in April. Before that, though, I just want to thank AIDA and Andrés and all the team for the opportunity to join you here today. I found the webinars that AIDA did at the beginning of the pandemic about challenging the notion of extractivism as a solution to get us out of the pandemic really insightful and useful, and I think really ties into the narratives that are being promoted around extractivism to solve the climate crisis and the post-COVID recovery, if you like. Just a little bit about War on Want, where, and first, because I know it's difficult to translate this into Spanish or into any language, given the fact that want is not a commonly used word. Well, it has a different meaning. War on Want would normally translate to guerra contra la necesidad, and it grew out of the labor movement in the 1960s, and it's an organization working on social justice and human rights across many themes, ranging from trade to justice for Palestine and of course the ecological crisis. And I just want to pick up on one thing that Whit was mentioning about how we arrived at to the material transition report, and recognize that it has been a process of constant dialogue with the communities who, for the last 500 years, but more recently, since the commodity boom of the early 2000s, have been on the front lines of resisting the expansion of different forms of extractivism. And it was towards the end of 2019 when, alongside our friends in Chile, Olca, and Mining Watch Canada, and in the lead up to COP25, and also in the lead up to what was going to be the historic social uprising in Chile, that we first sort of got together to just try and bring together collective learnings about the expansion of lithium mining, copper mining in the so-called lithium triangle. And so I just wanted to sit, and that was what resulted from that was the report that Whit mentioned, a justice transition is a post-extractive transition. And this in many ways is a continuation and a building on that. Okay, so what I want to do for the next few minutes is kind of situate this really existential and question and this challenge that we have about how we usher in a material transition that is equitable, that is just, and that helps us also to address the climate crisis. And I want to situate that in the context of the broader climate crisis and sort of broader climate politics. And to do that, I want to begin by talking about one of the frameworks that's been most successful at articulating an alternative that helps to deal with the climate crisis, and that is the Green New Deal. So the Green New Deal, you could say, or the Green New Deals are a set of ambitious national policy frameworks that are designed to create millions of jobs by addressing the intersection between the climate crisis and the crisis of inequality. And though proposals vary from country to country, largely speaking, the way in which it seeks to do this is through things like supporting mass transit, renewable energy infrastructure, the electrification of transport, amongst others, and all in a bid to reduce emissions while addressing inequality. But more recently, there have been a number of challenges that have been sort of proposed by proponents of Green New Deals, or at least those who have some more radical and progressive visions of Green New Deals, about the global justice dimensions that must be central to any any Green New Deal framing, and that is based on a recognition that Green New Deals up until this point have been developed and framed almost exclusively within the confines of wealthy G7 countries. But as well as recognizing that, there's a recognition that climate justice cannot be achieved unless it is achieved through an internationalist approach that's due to the interconnected nature of our world and our systems, but also because of the dynamics of global capitalism. So in order to do this, Green New Deal frameworks, first and foremost, need to take on the historical responsibility of the global north in creating this area of climate crisis and surging inequality. And that means grappling with the question of how to achieve rapid and globally just decarbonization, but without creating new sacrifice zones as of the type we've heard about today, or reproduce the inequities and injustices of our current economic system. And at the root of that, as Whit sort of laid out, is tackling the question of the logic of unfettered growth and consumption in the global north. And just as an aside here, you know, this logic and the patterns of consumption really illustrate the inequities that are present in the climate crisis, and that namely is that those least responsible for the climate crisis who are the most vulnerable to it and stand to bear the heaviest brunt because of it, are also overall the patterns of consumption fit that inequity in terms of where, for example, energy is consumed, but who stands to bear the heaviest brunt of the energy transition as it's being imagined in the mainstream. And I want to talk about that a little bit, about that unjust, that arbitrary, and that unplanned transition and that pathway. So I think the first thing to say is that the projections for the materials and minerals needed for renewable energy technologies, projections made by the International Energy Agency or the World Bank, are really subject to a whole range of political, economic choices. And these determine sort of the rate and the scale and the conditions under which extraction happens. So it's not a given or an absolute truth. And as the report lays out, and also as a recent report by Earthwork lays out, there needs in order to transform the demand, there needs to be a series of interventions and strategies, as Whit also outlined. But I think another element that's really relevant to the mainstream pathway, if you like, is how it gives rise to sort of ecofascism and an eco-fascist sentiment in the global north, as there is a scramble to secure critical minerals, invoking the language of empire, as has been the case in the UK following Brexit. We're going to see national security interests, protectionist policies, and increased competition, which we're already seeing with regards to China. And just as an example, take the EU Green New Deal, and I really highly recommend Yes to Life, No to Mining's analysis alongside civil society organizations in Europe that really break down how the language of the Green New Deal is being greenwashed to push through this highly protectionist and aggressive trade policy agenda. And you know, needless to say, this approach will hugely undermine the type of global cooperation that we need to address the climate crisis in the first place. Not only will it undermine that need, but it will also incentivize extractivism. So in those projections, with the World Bank that estimates there will be an increase in demand of 500% for lithium by 2050, for example, we are we're going to generate there will be a series of bottlenecks, and effectively, not only are you reproducing or switching the inequities of the fossil fuel energy system by renewable energy and keeping and locking in those existing inequalities, but you'll also be coming up with a against a barrier to actually be able to produce the renewable energy that's needed, given the rise in demand in the global north. So the answer can't be more extraction. We need a political framing that takes decision making out of the rubric of competition altogether. And so the final dynamic that I want to highlight has to do with the political, economic, and social context of where extractivism or new forms of extractivism are taking place. Yesterday, I saw a report which had found that trillions of dollars poured into rescuing economies around the world from the COVID-19 crisis had been spent in ways that worsen the climate crisis and harm nature, because governments have failed to fulfill promises of a green recovery from the pandemic. And to me, it was interesting.
Excuse me, this is the interpreter. Can you please slow down?
Sorry.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll start that bit again. So it was interesting to me that at the top of the list of this report, we had European countries like Denmark, France, Spain, and the UK, who were ranked the highest in what they described as the greenness index. Now, I think I don't want to undermine what the report is saying, because I think it's still shocking in the context of the conversations around the recovery, but it does lead us to think about the response to the pandemic, which is still unfolding so destructively across so much of the world. And to reference those two webinars that I mentioned that AIDA ran at the beginning, when all this was unfolding, we've seen throughout the pandemic that lockdowns, repression, criminalization, and deregulation, coupled with huge amounts of sovereign debt and the acute needs of populations who have borne the brunt of the economic crisis unleashed by the pandemic, what we get is a perfect sort of concoction, or the conditions for the expansion of extractivism as an easy short-term solution to be able to generate economic growth. And this reminded me of something that a colleague and friend, Lucio Cuenca, who's the director of the Latin American Observatory for Environmental Conflicts, OLCA, in Chile, who said that for so many centuries, the myth of development had been used to legitimize the expansion of extractivism. And following the Paris Agreement, it was the needs of the world that were being utilized and instrumentalized in order to legitimize the expansion of extractivism. And now it's the greater good of coming out of the pandemic that is being instrumentalized in this way. And I'll end with this, which is a question that I think those of us who are in the global north need to be asking ourselves, and is, how is it that those of us who are talking about a shift to renewable energy can do so without talking about the fiscal consequences of that shift for places in the global south, who have had the historical and geopolitical barriers that impeded them from developing a diversified economy, that are constrained by debt burdens and by the way in which global commodity markets behave. What we have is states that are already on the brink. And And so we really need to sort of grapple with that, to think about the different pathways and the alternative pathways that exist for how we can deal with the climate crisis in a way that's just, that's equitable, and that addresses the fundamental question of our resource intensive and growth oriented economy. I'll end there. Maybe we can get into some of these questions in the Q&A. I'm sorry for going so quickly.
That's all right, Seb. Thank you very much. Very, very, very interesting presentation, and perhaps we can share with our attendees some of your thoughts in written form, so that they can have a main idea. As takeouts, I take, of course, the fact that this is an unjust, arbitrary, and unplanned transition. That projections are based in scenarios. They are not absolute truths, and this is something that we have always said when the main institutions in the world are saying that we need these minerals in order to keep the system. Well, what we need is a change of the system. We are not aiming for the same system. So when they are talking about continuing with the economic growth in a finite planet, and they are planning to do this extraction for that scenarios, we always ask, well, why not change the system, right? So that's a wonderful takeout that I have. The concept of ecofascism, which is something that we can discuss more in the coming minutes, but also nationalism and other sentiments and approaches to this current crisis. We have even had jokes from billionaires about coup d'etats, which are really concerning. And finally, the main take, which is that the answer cannot be more extraction, right? We are in a crisis, and you gave the example of COVID-19. We are in a crisis, in a destructive pandemic, which probably some people like brought to our species for some of their actions. And we are actually having a destructive response to the pandemic. So we are just deregulating. We are proposing unsustainable projects. Right now here in Colombia, a couple of days ago, we have a new energy transition law in Colombia that includes things like blue hydrogen, which is produced burning fossil fuels. So how blue and how sustainable is something that it's produced burning fossil fuels. It doesn't matter that you capture all the carbon, because the industry and the sector itself are going to have enormous costs, not only in terms of climate change, but in biodiversity loss and many pressures to the environment. And it also deregulates, actually. It has an article which a colleague from AIDA pointed out just yesterday to me. And the article says that basically they are going to flexibilize any environmental tramits or processes that they have to do in order to get the licenses for operation. So extremely, extremely concerning. And with that, I would invite you to a couple of questions. I will ask the first question to Andy, then we're going to move to Seb. Of course, Seb or Andy, if you want to pitch in each other's questions, you're free to do it. But we are going to start with the first one, and is by Amanda. Which of the laws, standards, and schemes in the supply side solutions do you think are the most effective or best designed?
Excellent. Thanks. That is a good question. But before I answer that, I just want to follow up on one thing that Seb said particularly. And I should have also praised the different webinars that you've already done. And there's so many links there. But I think the point that particularly Seb was making at the end in terms of the potential amount of extra mining that's going to happen because of the post-recovery from COVID-19, is a really interesting one. And clearly, we've concentrated now on potential extra mining for mineral transition. That's also potentially going to be on top of the what's required. And then maybe even, people are talking about the potential industrialization of India in the same way that China industrialized. And so, the industry is talking about this idea of a super cycle. which is sort of continual growth effectively. You might have a bit of up and down, but basically it's heading, all prices and all production is heading up. And I don't know if that is going to happen. I think chances of it happening are greatly increased if you have both extra mining for material transition and extra mining for infrastructure for COVID recovery. So that's something to bear in mind. But on the question, I think part of the problem is that there are, certainly in terms of laws, there are so many laws that have bits. I mean, there are laws that maybe just focus on one area, I guess is the nature of laws, but it's just, it's unfortunate. For instance, we have a UK Modern Slavery Act. So that's clearly applicable to part of the supply chain, but not all. And then you have laws that in principle could be good. In Canada, the idea of an ombudsman, yet they've got in practice, it's got no practical teeth, it's got no real power. You have the French law of vigilance, which again looks a very strong law on paper. It only applies to very large companies, so many other companies slip through. And you have, for instance, in the European Union, where you have conflict mineral regulation that's just practically started. In some ways, it's better than what the United States did with the Dodd-Frank Act, because it covers the whole globe rather than just focusing on a geographical area. Again, it has problems because it sets limits on which companies can be fall within the remit of the law. It's really difficult. It's just, it's not like there's one good law, but so many laws have good ideas that can set examples to others. And I think it's interesting, particularly as more countries are starting to go through a process of having human rights due diligence laws, that there is really, they can cherry pick, they can pick out the best bits from other laws. But I think on voluntary schemes, I mean, in general, we're fairly critical of voluntary schemes. Many of them are initiated by industry, and clearly where you have industry schemes, some of them, I think for instance, I would say the aluminium scheme is not too bad. That actually has, they've tried to do their best to make it properly a multi-stakeholder. In general, I think most industry-run schemes, aren't really fit for purpose at all. And then the last thing to say on this is that I think, that so far it seems there's been only one genuine attempt with regards to minerals to have a proper multi-stakeholder scheme, which is the IRMA, the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance. And it's in very early stages, but it sets a very high bar, especially in terms of how it deals with communities, how it deals with free, prior, informed consent. But just in the principle of its governance, it really has equality. And it not only includes NGOs, it actually specifically has communities involved, which I think is really good. Not the idea that NGOs represent civil society, they don't. People get to speak for themselves. So it's early days, and not many people have volunteered for it yet. I think it's interesting, and I think it's promising.
Thank you very much, Andy. Seb, Eduardo is asking, how does in all this Latin America play? I mean, what's the role of Latin America in all this? Should we allow for some extraction to be the champions of the transition, like within a fairer framework, like with fairer schemes or whatever? Or should we not allow any transition at all? No, extraction at all, sorry.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that whatever Latin America does as a continent, I think the first thing to say is that it can't happen in isolation. So the policies that can potentially, and this sort of lean into the question that was asked previously, the current policies and laws in place, as Whit has sort of outlined aren't enough. We have to be ambitious in what we promote in terms of the repurposing of these technologies, the reuse of electric vehicle batteries, for example, and the ways in which we can affect broader societal change. But these policies that I think are at the heart of the ambition in the global north that could help to reduce overall levels of extraction can only happen if the policies that are being promoted in the global south and in Latin America respond to that. And so what do I mean by that? You know, we have, for example, Andrés was just speaking about the new energy transition law in Colombia and the introduction of blue hydrogen and all these different forms of enabling extractivism. I think there are some real battle sites in these types of sort of post-COVID energy transition proposals where the communities, the organizations, the networks that have been on the front lines of these conflicts for decades need to be shaping those policies in terms of how we achieve a post-extractive transition. And you know, I will take the example that that's I think is most inspiring at the moment. Not to give more value to one particular exercise of popular resistance, but in Chile, the way in which, since the social uprising, social movements and local communities have been able to introduce provisions around, yes, the regulation of mining, but also the protection of water and the recognition of nature as a subject of rights, is fundamentally the way in which we are able to demand that the policies that come from the global north. So there is a dynamic there, but I think that there needs to be a fundamental shift in the global north, pressured and supported by those communities and societies in the global south. Would be my take. I don't know, with Andrés.
Awesome, Seb. Thank you very much. We have another one for Andy, and this one is one that I would like to merge. It's a question by Andrés and a comment by Jamie. So they're referring to the fact that economy is inherently entropic, of course, like the whole universe is. It cannot be circular because new energy is always needed for new transformations. So how can we cope with this physical reality in this approach? That would be the first one. And the second one, like the comment from Jamie, was that the second law of thermodynamics means that there is no 100% efficient circular systems, because some entropy is created in every process and every transformation. So what are your opinion or your take on that, Andy?
Yeah, I think both of those are clearly right. You can't deny the laws of physics. But I think the essence of it is what we're aiming for is circularity. I mean, I think we're aiming for it. And to me, I mean, what the most important thing is that is how you're aiming for it as well. I mean, one thing that was surprising to me was how many different definitions of the circular economy there are. If you start looking, people have all sorts of different ways they interpret the circular economy. And it's interesting that, like green growth, business has become very, very excited about the idea of how they can make money out of circular economy. Now, maybe sometimes that will benefit society. I think most of the time it won't benefit society. So it really comes down to what you're trying to do is to minimize the amount of resources that go in. As I don't think you ever will stop. Certainly, the level we are currently consuming at is just way, way, way too high and too unfair as well. It's not even just about the total amount that's being used. It's about the differences between often the global north and global south, even within countries. It's not just that simple, it's actually differentiated within countries as well. And interestingly, I saw a question in the chat, because it's probably good to link that in now as well, about population. I think that is an interesting one, and clearly, population is an important issue within it. So I don't think it should be forgotten, because clearly the number of people on the planet matter in terms of resource use. I would say it's not the most important. I mean, what's interesting to me is that if you look at the per capita material footprint, so in terms of low-income countries, you're talking about, again, from 1970 up until quite recently, it's gone from about 1.5 ton to about 2 ton per person. And if you look at the consumption in high-income countries, you're talking about, in 1970, 20 tons. So you're talking about, again, it's not the absolute number of people, it's about what they're using. But also, that's now risen to 27 tons. So you not only have structural unfairness, you have increasing structural unfairness. So so again, I mean, clearly population is part of that. It has to be part of the solution to think about that. I really think it's, in comparison to that increasing structural unfairness, it's not so important.
Thank you very much, Andy. Yes, and I would add, from a personal point of view, that one of the wonderful things that ecological economics has done for the world, for the concepts of economics, for all the fields, is that they have actually put thermodynamics into the equation, right? They have located all the markets and all the things, and they have said, hey, we have boundaries around the markets, and this is not coming from nowhere. Nature is not just an infinite thing that you can exploit forever. So, like, being aware of these kind of things, I feel that it's very useful, and it's very also useful to know that there are critiques to circular economy, but that even the academics talking about circular economy, they recognize that there is like a point where you cannot make the processes more efficient. You always have to use more energy and more materials because even a tire, the tires, when you, I don't know, drive a mile, they degrade a little bit. They just, some atoms get blown out because of the friction and all of the things. But if we can achieve a conscious level of consumption that takes that into account, like we could have resources for many, many hundreds or thousands of years. If we do it right, rationally, etc., not precisely what we are doing now, burning fuel with internal combustion engines, which is one of the worst ideas to do with hydrocarbons, for example. So that would be one take. And we also, I would also like to do the transition of the topic that you mentioned about Roberto's question on population to degrowth. There are many takes on degrowth, right? There are many schools of thought, etc. But this idea has been refined and has been taking an approach where degrowth is not necessary right now for everybody at the same pace for every country, but the idea that the global north can actually leave some room for consumption to the global south to meet social demands has been growing. So why do you guys think about this idea of degrowth, both Andy and Seb, and what are your takes on this?
Should I start, Seb? That's okay. Yeah, I mean, I think we do address it in the report, and I think we, as far as the report is concerned, as far as I'm concerned, I do think it is the antidote, it is the solution in a way to this idea of green growth. I think I don't like the term degrowth. I think people see it as negative, and they kind of assume, particularly if you're in the north, it's very difficult to sell it to someone because it pictures up this idea that we're going to be giving away something. And actually, what it's about is stopping the idea that we have to have continual growth at the center of our economics. And I think that's the central point. that it's exponential increase in materials is because we have exponential growth. And so, we need a decoupling. We need to decouple resource use from society. But I think now the evidence pretty much says that we can't continue to have growth and resource decoupling, that we can't continue to grow and use less resources. We need to consider how we're going to use them. So I think, what's interesting is that I think it should be an easy sell for everyone, even people in the north, the global north, even to us, because but again, it depends how you sell it. And I think some of it is just we need to reformulate our relationship to natural resources, to the earth. That much is clear. Again, Roberto kind of pointed out that if we don't do this, nature will reset it for us. And you'd think that we would have the common sense together to realize, in terms of climate change, in terms of biodiversity, vulnerable crises that we can relive. Actually, it's a positive decision as well. There are so many aspects of it that are about changing, individual ownership, common ownership. It shouldn't be seen as a threat. That should be seen as an opportunity. There's no reason now. Increasingly in the West, even companies are now looking to the idea that you rent cars for use rather than having an individual person own them and it sits on the sidewalk for days doing nothing while it's not being used. But also, it's about how we live. If we lived, coming together, for me, living together in a more communal experience, doing away with advertising, which is just selling this constant idea that we need more materials without making us happy. So I think all of those aspects kind of mean that if those of us who started off in life as campaigners around mining and believe first and foremost in solidarity, as I mentioned in my presentation, I do think that the people we're in solidarity with are the people that are showing us how to live. And that's a lesson that I take from this, and hopefully that's a lesson that we can tell to other people in our countries, in my country. But Seb, I don't know if you want to add anything.
I think that's great, and I think it tackles the crux of the question. In the UK and in the UK left, there's a reticence and a sort of visceral reaction to the language of degrowth, because it's sort of in a narrative associated with middle class environmentalists demanding or putting forward some sort of vision where working class communities aren't able to reap the benefits of society that they have. And I think part of the challenge of degrowth is challenging that narrative, right? And it's about recognizing that it's less about denying people those opportunities. I'm talking within Britain, but more about how we bring our economy in balance with the planet. But in terms of north to south, I think that Whit captured it in a nutshell. And it has to do with the previous question around population growth, but the overwhelming majority of the consumption is so highly concentrated in the global north, whether it's energy or other products, that it's really about tackling those patterns of consumption at the root. So anyway, there are two great sort of scholars of degrowth, Jason Hickel and George Kalikis, sorry if I got that wrong, who I think really do a great job in breaking down what degrowth is and degrowth isn't. So I would point to them.
Yes,
right?
Yeah. Yes. And then Jason Hickel has also said, I think he's got a great quote where he just says, there's no way that you can get to 1.5 degrees centigrade down to that without some sort of substantial change in the north in terms of energy, resource, land use. It is a fantasy to believe otherwise. And I think, in a way, that's the reality that's going to hit people. So when it does, I think it is a job of us being able to sell the idea of what it means. And as Seb says, it's not, I think there is an idea of fairness in it, and I hope that fairness isn't necessarily seen as it's not about trying to stop people or keep people where they are. It's about ensuring that we are more equal as a society in how we use resources.
That's right, Andy. So, and a topic that also joins our interests, Andy's, Seb's, and mine, is deep sea mining. So there was a question by Esteban about deep sea mining. What are the impacts of this deep sea mining? And I would like to introduce this question with the thought that if we are getting to the extent of proposing getting to zones that we have never been in, that we have never studied, that we have never paid attention to, which are the 70% of this planet, how desperate is this species for materials or for economic growth, right? For wealth, but also how are we going to deal with these last frontiers that we have? We have the deep ocean, but we also have the Antarctic Treaty ending in 2040s, somewhere in the 2040s, and there are people also right now thinking about space mining. So when do we start thinking that enough is enough, and that these far-fetched proposals, how do we get the message across that these are no-go zones and not go-now zones, as I call them, because people are like mistaking those. Andy.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it's an interesting one, because I mean, in the reports I do look at different types of perhaps technical fixes. And yeah, there are interesting ones. There's phyto mining, the idea that you can grow plants which are effectively taking some of the metals out of the soil and you harvest the plant. There's some about biological removal, which could clean up tailings dams, landfill mining, basically old landfills in the north. And some of these, again, they're early days, a lot of them. But in theory, they're particularly where they're going to brownfield sites, to old sites, and maybe cleaning them up. They look like they could be good, as long as they're done with the full consent of any communities around them. I think sometimes even in recycling, we forget that they can be dirty processes. And so, I think all of those still need community consent. It also looks at ones that I would say are really bad potential solutions, and deep sea mining is one of those. Deep sea mining is definitely given as one of the areas where we don't need to worry about expanding terrestrial mining, because we can now go off into this new frontier. And I think that's the great tragedy, is it is a new frontier. We really shouldn't be thinking about opening up new areas to extraction, particularly somewhere like the ocean, which is still an area that's acting as a carbon sink. I mean, there are moral reasons, there are perfectly good scientific reasons, not least we just don't really understand enough yet about the ocean to understand the impact we would have. So, there are so many reasons that we don't want to be moving into mining the deep sea. I think the space one is in a way, the most interesting, because the good thing, I think, space mining is that even if it ever happens, it's going to be in a time scale that's so far outside the climate crisis that I don't think it will ever be used as an excuse to transition minerals. I think it's such a great example of how so much of how mining operates and capitalism operates is just on making money quickly. So already you have small countries in Europe that set up their own kind of mining space agencies, and they're selling asteroids. They're making money already on something that's so speculative, and that's just pretty much an almost abstract version of how mining has worked in the past. This idea, you stake areas, you make them your own, you claim them, and you can make money out of them without even digging a hole. And so yeah, I think space mining in a way sums up more than anything else kind of what's wrong with how the modern mining system works, really. But yeah, I truly hope that we can stop the idea that in the meantime that deep sea mining is going to be some sort of solution for this, because it clearly isn't. But you may well have things to add to yourself, Andrés, because I know you're working in this area as well.
Well, I would like to leave the last 10 minutes to you guys. So a quick round of questions. The first one for you, Seb, very, very quick. What is ecofascism? You talked about ecofascism. How would you define ecofascism? This is a question from Victor.
Thanks, Andres. And actually, I was about to answer the question around the new frontiers of mining by referring to ecofascism, because and it kind of points to what Whit said about by the time that that space mining can be legitimized as a tool through which to extract transition minerals and metals, we'll have an unlivable planet. And so ecofascism really refers to as the impacts of the climate crisis and the broader ecological crisis become more widespread. You know, we're seeing floods in London of the type I've never seen, and that's, you know, something, a small example considering the horrendous fires and other climatic events that we're seeing across the world. And as these dynamics accentuate, accelerate, and become more destructive, proponents or ecofascism has been the way through which we understand and describe how policies of protectionism, of nationalism, of militarism and surveillance, of authoritarianism are employed in order to create a great divide between the people who will aim to save themselves and those who simply have to be sacrificed. So we're already seeing what that looks like in some of the world's most authoritarian regimes in terms of the proliferation of militarism, surveillance, and security, and the role of private military security companies. And I think mining companies are, to talk about deep sea mining and space mining, are tapping into that narrative, but in a way that really presents them as a solution bearer. So we know that in the climate justice movements, there's a whole host of debates around net zero and the likes of BP and Shell essentially offsetting their carbon emissions by planting trees with no real mechanisms through which we can address the scale and of the climate crisis. Mining companies are in a much better position in that sense, because they say, well, what you definitely need us. We don't extract oil, although some mining companies have oil and gas operations. But I think that's the narrative that through which they enable their operations. But really what hides behind it is this notion that has been historically applied of colonizing and controlling and exploiting nascent territories. So I think there's an interesting parallel there that we should explore.
I would also like to add that perhaps the eco, this prefix eco in fascism, is just like a species of a scapegoat. You know, it's not really eco. It's not for the planet. It's for my kids in my city, in my little environment. So it's not really eco. It has the appearance of eco, and right now it has to do with the transition. But you know, capitalism would look for ways and find ways to sell anything. So I think this fascism has to do with very, very personal interests rather than collective ones. So that's what I would like to think, because anyway, there is an excellent comment in the chat in questions and answers about, and I think that we have enough time, but I didn't want to leave without doing the question that Rosa is posing from Argentina. But there is an excellent question, Andy, that I invite you to read by Daniel Castrejon about Papua New Guinea. And it has to do, of course, with the topic that we have talked about earlier. But I would really like to close this space with a question for you, Andy, and for Seb, of course, from like the perspective on war on want. How does the London Mining Network works? First of all, if you have any advocacy strategies for the global north to make this social change happen in terms of the energy transition, what are they like? Can you explain them a little, and how can we participate from the global south? This is a question from Rosa from Argentina.
That's a good way to end. We work in a number of ways. I mean, some of the work we do is in direct solidarity with communities, impacted communities, and I think that's where a lot of our focus is. So we're particularly doing what we can to get their message across directly to companies, to financiers in London. Particularly, we like to invite them to London when, in the days when people could travel, so people can hear their voices directly. That's obviously become more difficult now. We also lobby our own government and work with others lobbying the European government. So we have a working group that's specifically focused on transition minerals, and there's different member groups who have an interest in it. Some of them have been lobbying political parties in my country, and some of them are working towards parliamentary parliamentary interest groups, but also ideally legislation, particularly on the issue of either ensuring that supply chains are fair and just, or increasingly on this issue of limit to growth. But Seb, I don't know if you want to add anything else. Either I may have missed an element, or from Warren wants.
No, I think that's a good overall description, but I would just add that where COP26 is happening in the UK this year, and there are multiple reasons to believe that mining companies, the UK government, are positioning themselves as these great sort of climate leaders. And in the negotiations themselves, there are a whole set of debates about how to challenge those dominant narratives. And I think the role of LMN, who has the historic experience of working with accompanying, supporting, and platforming, sorry, I'm going quick, and amplifying the work of frontline communities, is crucial in the type of interventions we make, not only in the lead up to COP26, but beyond it. So I think this year is a little different. Well, since the pandemic, everything has been different, but there's an extra challenge in how we ensure our interventions continue to be shaped by frontline communities, even when they might not be able to be present.
Yeah. And one final sentence, because I should really say that one of the key issues of the report and the work we'll be doing after it is to take some of these ideas that we've got, particularly around it being a material transition, not just a climate change transition, and also the circular society, and spread them around. We need to, through other NGOs. So obviously an opportunity like this to talk to others is really useful, but hopefully we will have plans to get communication materials and share them through you as well.
Sure, Andy. And of course, as AIDA, we offer ourselves as the bridge between these awesome presenters, Warren Want and the London Mining Network. So you can do all the questions and everything and get in touch with these people, because they are experts. They have worked with this and supported communities for years, decades. We really admire their work, and we're really happy to have them here today. So we are going to keep trying to be this bridge of communication between you guys and everybody of us here in Latin America and these kind of experts. So thank you very much for being here, and I hope this is not the last time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Seb.
Thank
Bye.
you so much.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you to the translation team. Awesome
Thank
job.
you very much.
Thank you, Victor.
Thank you for the interpretation.
Bye-bye.